Hello and welcome to the Game Theory Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Vicini. We're powered by CLNS Radio. And today's show, we're going to talk briefly at the top about the national championship game, but mostly we're going to get into off-season matters today. I've brought on good friend of the program, Raphielle Johnson from over at FanRag Sports. He does a great job. This guy watches more basketball than any human being that I think I've ever met, especially college basketball. So he's going to know a lot of the random people like Michael Weathers and Marcus Evans and James Daniel from over at Howard that we can talk about that are really interesting potential high major transfers coming from lower levels. So how you doing, Raph?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was awesome the first time. Your show was underrated, one of the more listened to podcasts, and I feel like that goes to show how impressive your depth of knowledge is. But before we get into that crazy, transfer scene, what did you think of the national title game? Because I took a week off of the podcast for a little, just a little respite after I got back from Phoenix on Tuesday morning. What were your impressions of the way that the Final Four in the national title game went down?
Well, I thought the Final Four was entertaining, but in terms of the title game specifically, it's a little too stop and go in terms of the flow of the game. There really wasn't much of a flow of the game. And part of that's on the players of both teams needing to adjust to how the game was being called, but I'd also argue that the whistle was a bit tight in that game. I think if anything, it may open up the door to more discussions about either going the four quarters or doing the team foul reset that they used in the NIT as kind of an evaluation type deal, because if you have teams getting into the bonus with about 11, 12 minutes to go in a half, that's pretty much it in terms of your flow of the game, unless a team just basically refuses to play defense so they don't commit any more fouls. So I think that would be the biggest thing I'd take away from the weekend, outside of the fact that Carolina kind of redeeming themselves, so to speak. I'm not too big on that term, because they lost on a last-second shot. It's not like they're redeeming themselves from like a first-round exit or something a year prior. So Carolina accomplishing that, Gonzaga getting onto the Final Four stage, I think those are probably the two biggest things I'd take away from that weekend from a team standpoint.
Yeah, I agree. I didn't really buy into the whole redeem factor for North Carolina. I mean, what are they redeeming themselves of being the second-best team in college basketball last season? I didn't really get it. And it wasn't the same team as last year. Like, I understand that a lot of those guys were on the team, but Bryce Johnson and Marcus Page were such an integral factor of that team that I was just like, what are we even talking about here? Why are we, considering this a redeem situation here? To be honest, I couldn't really, because of that, because I didn't really care about the redeeming factor of it, I couldn't latch on to any real storyline with North Carolina. I think that they have some interesting dudes. Like, I think Justin Jackson, who I'm writing about at Vice this week, he's taken some interesting steps in his game, especially as a shooter. And I think that Tony Bradley's an interesting long-term player. And, the Joel Berry play throughout the Final Four was really interesting. He's a really solid point guard who dictates tempo for them so well. But I just couldn't latch on to any storyline. With Gonzaga, I got to tell you, I was rooting for Gonzaga to win that game because their story of going for 20 years under Mark Few and building this program basically from the bootstraps up, from Dan Fitzgerald, Dan Monson, up to Mark Few, and Few has taken this thing to a whole new level, and I wrote about that throughout the week at Sporting News. It's a better story to me. It's a better, more engaging storyline, I guess, that this little small Jesuit school in Eastern Washington, builds this massive basketball power, goes to a title game, wins a title, and Mark Few becomes one of the, if he wins that title, he is probably one of the, 20 best coaches in college basketball history at that stage, given the fact that he has 600 wins and, has built up this crazy long resume of, NCAA tournament appearances, and that would be a title as well on top of it. So that's the storyline I was rooting for, but, kudos to North Carolina. They earned it. And you brought up the officiating, and good God. Let's just call it what it was. That game was very poorly officiated. Not only was it bad in terms of The fact that they just flat out missed calls, like Kennedy Meeks being out of bounds at the end of the game with, I think, 35 seconds left. Like, that was not the only call that they just flat out missed. But they called it differently from the first half to the second half, and I think that's why you saw both teams being in the bonus, like, from the 12 or 13 minute mark on in the second half. They kind of let a lot more go in the first half than they did in the second half, and that created a situation where, you know, Zach Collins gets this phantom foul call that, you know, totally changes the complexion of the game, and Kennedy Meeks beats Shemek Karnowski to a spot, and Shemek, like, runs into him, bounces off of him, and they call Kennedy Meeks for a foul. Like, I don't know what the NCAA, this is a rule change year. They need to, like, seriously go in and make a significant investment in officiating, because like, this company makes billions of dollars on the NCAA tournament just from TV deals alone. And if you can't reinvest like $7 million of that into officiating, go out and hire 30 officials, $6 million, let's say. Go out and hire 30 full-time officials, because none of these officials are full-time, as I think probably most of our listeners know. If you go out and hire 30 officials full-time, pay them $200,000 a year, and just say, hey, we're going to do everything you can, drop everything. John Higgins, you have this roofing company. Drop that. We want you to become a full-time official at $200,000 a year, and we want you to become the best official you can possibly be and dedicate your entire time to it. We're going to give you more rest than you get throughout the course of a season where you're traveling all across the country. We're going to make sure and schedule your games out better. We're going to make sure that you are going to be the best possible official you can be, and we're going to pay you for it. To me, that makes so much more sense than continuing to get these negative headlines about officiating that have been perpetrated all year by people in the media, and I think they're absolutely correct on it.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I'm kind of up in the air on this, because I think there's some value in still, because I just wonder how it would work with, like, making officials full-time when you have so many different conferences that need games filled and whatnot. It's a bit different than the NBA, where you just have one league that you're answering to. You know, within each league, I don't know. I definitely think improvements need to be made. I kind of wonder if it's a situation that's a little bit tougher to solve than we may think.
Well, I'm not saying make every official full-time. I'm saying just, you know, make 30 of them full-time, so that when it comes to the NCAA tournament, we know that we're getting the best possible officials. And that's when everyone watches college basketball anyway. I mean, let's be honest, like, viewership for college basketball is not all that great throughout the regular season. They can probably deal with a lot of the negative headlines that come with officiating during the regular season. But whenever it continues to come during the NCAA tournament, I think it makes sense to at least try and mitigate the problem in some manner by going out, hiring a lot of full-time officials. Don't make it all full-time. Like, the Big West is not going to have full-time officials. But if you can get those, like, 30 guys that you throw on the big games regularly and have the NCAA overrule some of these conferences, I think it would be very beneficial. I do agree with you, though, that it's definitely a little bit more complicated than, like, just deciding to spend money on officiating.
Yeah.
Well, let's go forward into this transfer deal. So, before we get into the names, I kind of want to talk to you about just the idea of transfers in general, because you often see the term transfer epidemic. I think that Seth Greenberg tweeted it out yesterday. John Rothstein tweets out the phrase transfer epidemic. It seems like daily during the offseason. How ridiculous do you believe the term transfer epidemic is?
It's a damn joke, man.
It is.
I'm sorry. Like, they transfer at the same rate as regular students.
Oh, no, it's much lower.
Yeah, okay, yeah, you're right. It is lower than that. And when it comes to transferring, all of a sudden, these young men are no longer traditional students. But if you were to open it up, say, possible compensation or whatnot, then the argument turns into, well, they're just traditional students who do a little extra. And it's just this huge contradiction that I think is ridiculous. And I don't have an issue with it. If you're not happy somewhere, you think you can do better somewhere else, you should move on. And if you're running a program where someone doesn't want to be there, why would you want to keep that person there?
Yeah.
No, it doesn't make any sense.
I agree. Not only do you have, college athletes and particularly college basketball players, will tie it to, transferring at a lower rate than regular students. They transfer at basically an identical rate to coaches. Mm-hmm. So, these players who aren't paid, I mean, we can say that they get scholarships and they get advantages that other students don't. But the crux of the matter here is that they aren't paid. And you're limiting an unpaid student athlete's options by saying this is an epidemic and it is, we need to call this, thing of entitlement among younger people in the country, among millennials. And, I just wish it would go back to the way it was where we had all of these. It's so ridiculous. Yeah. Like, why are you trying to limit student athletes? And the funny thing is, so I had someone in my mentions last night, it's like, yeah, we have, let me pull up the exact tweet. It was just so outrageous. I was like, why are we even talking about this? He was like, yeah, is running away from a commitment really what's best for kids? Perfectly reasonable for adults who care about them to think it's not.
Yeah, okay.
And I was just like, except 18 to 22-year-olds are also adults. And the fact that we consider them kids or whatever is outrageous. These are adults who should be able to make decisions of their own free will. If you say that, these kids should be more limited in terms of the way that they transfer around the country, you are essentially saying, I am for limiting the options of young adults in their lives. And that is outrageous to me. It is so ridiculous to say that we should make sure that these kids have structure and are limited in what they can do to become the best versions of themselves at 18 to 22 years old. Look, they're young adults. They're going to make decisions. You make bad decisions when you're 18 to 22 years old. I made plenty of them. It's fine to say that they're young, but that they're also adults, and they should be able to make their own choices. I would be fine with a system where players can transfer freely. Forget even missing a year. I am fine with free transfers for everyone. I wish that would be the system, but I understand why there is a penalty in place. I do think that I don't necessarily have a problem with it. I would prefer the other system, but I don't necessarily have a problem with there being a penalty for transferring. But we already penalize these kids enough by making them sit out a year in terms of transferring. So get out of my face saying this is a transfer epidemic and it's such a problem. It's a scourge upon the college basketball world. That is insane to me.
See, the thing about the penalty for transferring, it's only in the revenue sports.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a non-revenue sport, you can just transfer and play immediately your next school. And, as you said about, people wanting to hold kids accountable and whatnot, I agree with you completely. They're not kids. And secondly, if you're going to say they're kids do what authority figures allow them to do. So whether it's another coach who may be tampering or, a hanger-on or whatnot, if you're not going to be as eager to hold the adults accountable, I really think that there's really no need to complain about this supposed transfer epidemic.
Yeah, and you look at the rate that coaches leave too. Some people say that, the reason that coaches end up leaving jobs is because of kids and it's a vicious cycle. And I'm just like, no, that's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. Coaches are going to leave for the best opportunity that's available to them. A lot of coaches aren't self-interested and they do care about kids, but a lot of them are. A lot of them, and it's possible to be self-interested in your own preservation as well as caring about kids. It's not an either-or situation. And I think that it's also possible to attack it like John Calipari does, where John Calipari says that he doesn't really like taking grad transfers. He doesn't really like to do that because of what he saw happen to Bruiser Flint at Drexel. Mm-hmm. If you don't like doing it, I'm okay with that. If you're a coach that says, I don't really like the way it affects my colleagues, I'm really not going to participate in it all that often, even though I think that they are going to participate in it this offseason because there's one guy that makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. I understand that perspective as long as you don't say, this is an epidemic that needs fixed around college basketball, because there's a difference between just saying I don't do it versus this is a scourge upon the entire industry.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about some of the guys that are transferring. Before we get into like the off-season transfers, I just want to note 5 guys that are mid-season transfers. They were top, like, a lot of them were like top 60, 70 kids or kids that have been super successful. Sam Cunliffe is going from Arizona State to Kansas. I think some people have kind of forgotten about him in their preseason, like top 25s or whatever. Really interesting, like bigger forward that can shoot it a little bit, that was playing reasonably well for Arizona State, but from the Pacific Northwest, it just kind of didn't seem like a total fit there, I guess.
Yeah.
Isaac Copeland's going from Georgetown to Nebraska. We'll talk about Nebraska as well. They have a couple of defections that I think are going to hurt them next year in Ed Morrow and Jariah Horn, but he's going to be a big one. If he is playing well, he is maybe the most impactful transfer, or let's say graduate transfer on the market, because he's going to be able to play next season. Is he going to be able to play immediately, or does he have to sit out the first semester? I can't remember.
I think he has to sit out the first semester, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. He's going to be really good, though, once the Big Ten season rolls around for them, if his head's on straight and everything. Harry Froling is going from SMU to Marquette. He's a guy that was one of the most sought-after international recruits last offseason. Again, just didn't seem like a great fit with Froling at SMU. They wanted to, really get up and down, play a switching, versatile defense. He's a big-bodied, 260-pound guy that is more of an interior presence who can step back and shoot a little bit, highly skilled player. He's going to replace Luke Fisher perfectly at Marquette, in my opinion. He's even going to provide a little bit more in terms of skill for them. Mickey Mitchell is going from Ohio State to UC Santa Barbara to Arizona State. I'm hoping at some point we get to see him actually play on the floor. He played a little bit at Ohio State, but he's a really fun player.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, Jamal McMurray is going from South Florida to SMU, right around a 20-point-per-game scorer at South Florida. A little bit of a selfish guy, but we'll see if he can kind of fit into the SMU culture and really become like a high-level lead guard for them, or a scoring guard, really. Does any of those names stand out to you?
I think I'd go Harry Froling, just because he's also improved his body since he's been up in Marquette in terms of getting in their workout program and slimming down a bit. So I think he can definitely help them. As you noted, with the loss of Luke Fisher, there's an immediate hole that needs to be filled there. They can surround them with shooters, obviously, guys like Marcus Howard. I think Andrew Rousey's back too, correct?
I believe that's correct, yeah, because I think he was a 2-year grad transfer.
Yeah. So, yeah, you got some shooters that can stand around Froling and work off of him, and he can also step out to the mid-range as well. So I think he may be the guy that kind of stands out to me, as I really think Marquette is positioned to take another step forward after getting to the tournament this year.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, they do lose some depth at guard.
Yeah.
With Dwayne Wilson going to Texas A&M and Tracy Carter. He left mid-season, I believe. But, those were 2 guys that I think they were kind of anticipating having next year. But it'll hurt their depth more than it'll hurt their, starting 5 that'll probably close games. So we'll see the way that they're able to kind of attack that. Let's move on to regular season guys. And let's start with 2 programs that have just been destroyed by transfers. Memphis loses Dedric and K.J. Lawson. They also lost, I think, 2 of their other top 6 scorers this year in what seems like an eventual Markel Crawford transfer, according to our good friend Gary Parrish, as well as who they lost another guy recently.
Keon Clergott.
Yeah, they lost him, and I think they even lost one more, to be honest. So that program is going to be just dreadful next year, because
they got a JUCO guy this morning, though.
Hey, that's great. Maybe they'll figure it out. But let's talk about Pitt as well. Pitt loses Cam Johnson, who I think is one of the more underrated great players in the ACC. Really, really good shooter at 6'7", 6'8". He's going to have 2 grad transfer years, which I think makes him, one of the 2 or 3 most valuable pieces on this transfer market. They also lose Krishan Clark, Corey Manigault, and Damon Wilson, as well as Justice Kithcart, who got kicked off the team like midway through the year, I believe. So they're going to lose, 5 of their young pieces that they were hoping to build around. Let's start here. Which situation is more dire right now, Memphis or Pitt, after they both went out and fired relatively successful coaches, essentially? I mean, they paid Josh Pastner to leave. Pitt essentially showed Jamie Dixon the door whenever he said that he wanted to go to TCU. So, I mean, they let these guys go, and now I think they're kind of seeing the downside of what happens whenever you leave successful coaches go, or let successful coaches go.
That's a good question in terms of which one's the worst situation, because they're both in really bad spots, obviously. I think the difference may be that Memphis has a more natural recruiting base in terms of right there in their city. That being said, Tubby and his staff really haven't done a good job of establishing those relationships.
Yep.
And when you're coaching in a place like Memphis or Chicago or LA, New York, that's something you should be working on as soon as you get the job. And it's something you keep appearances on throughout the season. So I think it's inexcusable for Memphis to be in the spot that they're in when you talk about the relationships or lack thereof. That being said, I think this is just another kind of hit for Pittsburgh to take that I think really started when they left the Big East. Obviously, it was a no-brainer from the financials, going from the Big East to the ACC, but while they started to move away from grabbing those New York City kids towards the end of that run there, losing that recruiting base, Barry Rosen was on the staff, obviously, at the time, and trying to go more into the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area where you're competing against the whole ACC, basically.
Yep.
That's made it really tough for them. And you add in all these departures, you lose your two best players, and Michael Young and Jamel Artis as well. I think Pitt is in serious trouble right now with Kevin Stallings.
I think Pitt is in a worse situation right now. Yeah. Just full stop. They're going to lose, like you said, Michael Young and Jamel Artis, who were awesome players. They also lose Sheldon Jeter and Chris Jones, who were kind of underrated guys. The best player on their roster right now is Ryan Luther, who is like a 6'4", or 6'8", like stretchy 4 kind of guy.
And the guy that Stallings cussed out on national TV a month ago.
Yeah. And this is the thing about, and we're going to talk about Kevin Stallings, who I think has been one of the more overrated coaches in college basketball for years. First and foremost, just because he had that great stretch at Vanderbilt, right, where he makes the NCAA tournament 5 of 6 years, 2007 to like 2011, 2012, something like that. He was one of the best offensive coaches in the country. And I think that from an analytical and X's and O's standpoint, that remains the case. Like, I think that he still is probably one of the best offensive coaches in college basketball. The problem is that he doesn't connect with kids anymore. Like, you listen to, I talked to Wade Baldwin at the NBA Combine last year, and you could tell that he was kind of holding back in terms of what his thoughts were on that Vanderbilt coaching staff. Like, he would occasionally let something slip that makes you think okay, this is not a great situation. And you see Kevin Stallings out here cussing out kids on national television, and you see him not recruiting well over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. And he has to build up an entirely new recruiting base to go to Pittsburgh. That hire at the time I said was atrocious. It was a joke. It was a search firm enabled disaster that happened in large part because Kevin Stallings' son, Jacob, plays for the Pirates, and he wants to be able to see him occasionally whenever he has like an off day, or, whenever the off season comes around and he can go to Pittsburgh or he can go to Indianapolis where the Pirates AAA team is and see them play. This was never going to – I don't understand why Pitt thought this was going to end well. You replace Jamie Dixon with a guy on the tail end of his career who hasn't been successful really in 5 years. What are you thinking whenever you make this hire? It is a joke to me.
It was befuddling because when they allowed Dixon to leave for TCU, you could tell there was some fatigue there in terms of the fan base and the administration.
And there was. I'm from Pittsburgh. I will say this. My brother texted me and was like, yeah, I think it's time for Dixon to go. And I'm just telling him, Chris, you're crazy, man. What are you – you don't know what you got until it's gone. Jamie Dixon's a great basketball coach.
I certainly get that, but
I get it though. I get the fact that you kind of run into malaise through consistency, right?
Yeah. I just wonder why you wouldn't try to make a splash hire, at minimum, someone that the fan base can identify with. Like, why not roll the dice on Brandon Knight? You know, if your program needs a spark. You know, obviously he hasn't been a head coach at Division I level, but he's one of your all-time greatest players. You know, a guy that fan base would associate with the successful run that they had at Pittsburgh under Ben Howland, and then eventually Dixon would take over. I mean, why not go with someone like that instead of going with someone who's looking to get out of their current situation and isn't really going to spark up that much excitement in your program? So maybe Stallings can turn it around, but it's going to be really tough.
I mean, what you need to have at Pittsburgh is you need to have young guys who are able to go out and recruit like crazy. You need grinders. You need guys who are really smart at evaluating talent. And I don't think we've seen that from Kevin Stallings in the last 5 years. And like the guys that I think would have fit there, you talk about Bryce Drew, who ends up taking the Vanderbilt job from Stallings. Will Wade would have been an interesting fit there because, again, just like a grinder, recruiter type, who also is like a smart basketball coach. He's really well respected throughout the industry. I'm just trying to think of like other guys. Like there were plenty of them out there. You can go out and get Kevin Keats last year, I'm sure, who ends up taking the NC State job this year. Like there were plenty of options out there for a smart, forward-thinking administration to go out and try and grab. But instead, you set the program back right now, I think by 4 years at least. Just looking at the talent that's on this roster right now and looking at, you know, the way that everything seems to be headed, this thing is set back by 4 years, I think. Like it's hard for me to see how they make the NCAA tournament within the next 3, I would say.
Yeah, it's not looking good for them at all, especially given how strong the ACC is. I think that Kevin Keats hire is really going to work out for NC State. Yep. So that's another program that's been down that could be moving, that should be trending up in the next couple of years. Boston College has some young talent, although I'm not sure about them making a serious climb up the standings. But you look at their guards, they've got good young talent to build around right now. So
between Jerome Robinson and Kai Bowman, they're going to finish ahead of Pitt next year.
Yeah, definitely.
I have like no doubt about that. Like they are actually doing a decent job of finding random like talented kids, you know? Yeah. And I think that says a lot about, you know, how difficult that Boston College job is first and foremost. You know, they're 9-23 last year, and I think they actually took a relative step forward, but it's just a difficult job, and I hope that Jim Christian figures it out, but I have zero faith in Pitt figuring it out. And I think that it says a decent amount about the Memphis job in terms of how quickly you can turn that if you go out and hire someone with connections within the Memphis area, because the American is not nearly as difficult a conference as the ACC. I think that it's possible to figure out a way to kind of make that work.
Like, even if it takes just grabbing a good assistant at Memphis, you know, you can easily cement yourself in the middle of that pack. You know, I think this year they won 19 games, but it wasn't really a standout performance by Memphis, and they still finished in the top half of the American. So
there was a point this year where Memphis was 18-7 and like popping up relatively on the bubble for some people. They beat Iowa, they beat Houston, like they had some relatively okay wins, right? Then they just lost like 7 of 8 down the stretch or whatever. And that kind of like destroyed all of their momentum. And I think probably was a big reason why they end up losing Dedric and K.J. Lawson. So let's start by talking about transfers now. That package deal is probably the best on the market, right?
I would say so. You know, I think the scenario a lot of people, myself included, kind of foresaw was maybe Dedric going pro and then KJ transferring. For them both to transfer and willingly sit out a year, one, that says a lot about the current climate down at Memphis, and two, that's a big get for a power program. Obviously, you don't know if Keelan's looking to get a job somewhere as well. I've heard he may be looking just to, you know, go back to doing the high school coaching thing and not really attaching himself to his sons. You get those two for a year, especially as talented as Dedric is. Both were double-digit scorers last year. So these aren't just your regular run-of-the-mill transfers. you put them in the right situation where they can work for a year and help you out scout team situations, they can be two high-impact guys when they get on the court in 2018.
Well, let's say this about Dedric, too. Like, Dedric was probably one of the 5 or 6 most underrated players in college basketball last season. Mm-hmm. He put up 19 points, 10 rebounds, 3 assists, 2 blocks, and a steal a game.
Yep.
Like, he had a 27 PER last year, and it was insane. Like, this guy is pretty much perfect for the 4 position in today's college basketball ecosystem. And last year they were small. Like, he played a decent amount of the 5 and was able to take advantage of a lot of those matchups. He's going to fit perfect wherever he goes, I think. Like, he is going to be a genuine impact player as a, he'll be 22 whenever he plays. That'll be his 22-year-old season at that stage. Mm-hmm. He's going to be a monster wherever he plays. KJ is going to be a double-digit scorer for a high major team. You also have the fact that Chandler is, I want to say, a top 30 kid in 2019, and they have another brother that
2021,
is, 2021. He's already like 6'5" or something, like 6'4". Like, he's a big kid already and looks like a basketball player. So it wouldn't surprise me if Keelan gets on a staff again, and I wouldn't blame a program for putting him on staff, given the fact that there's this massive pipeline of Lawsons coming in.
Yeah. And not to mention, there are other connections they have in that city's top town as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Memphis is a really underrated town as far as basketball talent. And if you can find any sort of connection you can to tap into that pipeline, it's very useful.
Like, they didn't just shoot their foot off with this loss of the Lawsons. They just completely sawed it off, basically. Like, it's absolutely amazing what that staff managed to do in losing the Lawson brothers, basically alienating Keelan from the start. Because I don't think they ever wanted to keep him on staff, but it was about, we need to keep him to keep Dedric for this season. So they did it, and now look at it. They got like 4 or 5 players, I think, right now. And I don't really see any impact guys of that 4 or 5. And I don't know if you're going to find too many immediate impact guys on the recruiting market at this stage either.
Oh, forget blowing your foot off by accident. They got a point-blank shotgun round to the chest that blew their body in half. Like, they're in trouble right now. They need to figure out a way to tap back into that Memphis market. Dedric and KJ are going to be fine. I think Dedric will probably get some NBA looks at some point. He was at the Combine last year, was the worst athlete at the Combine, but he was also 18 years old. So maybe he can kind of turn some things around once he gets a little bit older, a little bit stronger, everything that goes into that. A few other transfers here. I would say that, to me, the most underrated transfer on the market, like I said, is Cameron Johnson, 2-year grad transfer from Pitt. The word that is out there is Kentucky is going to take a pretty significant look at him, and I think that makes perfect sense. He's pretty much exactly what they need, but he's also basically what every program could use. Yeah. He's a 6'7" wing who shoots over 40% from 3 and has like a little bit of ball skill. Like, I think he's actually a pretty underrated NBA prospect, first and foremost.
Well, he's a true wing in every sense of the word. So, you can add that kind of guy. I think that was the kind of guy that Kentucky was really missing this season.
Yep.
A guy that's 6'7" who can stretch the floor for you. Because when you had Fox, Briscoe, and Monk on the court at the same time, while they did have Derek Willis out there too, you're asking Monk to not only be like a main offensive option, but he also had to be a floor spacer for them as well. So I think when you have a guy like Johnson who doesn't have to operate with the ball in his hands as often, although he can, I think that would be a big boost for Kentucky. But as you said, any program can use a boost that a Cameron Johnson would provide for the next 2 years.
Yeah, and Kentucky actually is going to have less floor spacing next year, which is insane to think about, because Quade Green can shoot a little bit. He's going to be okay from the point guard position, but you don't get as much floor space from primary ball handlers as you do from wings that can shoot the ball. Yeah. You look at who they're going to have. They have Hamidou Diallo, who has a somewhat projectable shot, but not a good shot. They're going to play Jared Vanderbilt probably at the 3, PJ Washington, maybe Mohamed Bamba. There's some talk that maybe Bam Adebayo returns. He's still without an agent entering the NBA draft process, but I'd be surprised if that happens. They really don't have any floor spacing on this roster, which is a little bit scary, I think, for them. And they should seriously take a look at Cameron Johnson, because they'd have him for 2 years and he would be an impact player for them for sure. But he'd be an impact player anywhere. Like, I think Duke could use him too. Like, Duke, I don't know that he's going to be able to transfer within the ACC, but like any program around the country could use Cameron Johnson. Carlton Bragg ends up leaving Kansas, which I think was probably the most predictable transfer of the offseason.
That needed to happen.
That needed to happen. He's a kid from Cleveland. I wonder if, something like Cleveland State, Akron, with new coaches there, John Gross at Akron, I forget who got the Cleveland State job, to be honest. That might be an interesting fit. Maybe he looks to go high major as well somewhere, but it just needed to happen at this stage after all of the off the court stuff this season. The fact that he never was able to enter the rotation for Bill Self, and this is something that people who watched him throughout high school kind of worried about when he went to Kansas. Like, he had a very similar skill set to what Perry Ellis did, but he was so inconsistent in terms of effort in high school that a lot of people had questions about how that was going to work with Bill Self, because Bill Self prides himself on being, good God, that was terrible English, I'm so sorry. Prides his team on, giving max effort, especially from the big men defensively. So that just needed to happen at this stage. He's a former 5-star recruit, though, that I think could probably play in any league in America if he finds the right fit in terms of, style of play and coach that's kind of willing to, deal with the mental baggage and everything that comes along with it.
Yeah, I think he needs to land at a spot where he'll be able to play through his mistakes some.
Yep.
Because at a place like Kansas, obviously maximum effort is going to be demanded anywhere, but in terms of Kansas, if you didn't give effort, you're coming out of the game quickly. And that's a guy that you could kind of tell the wheels were turning a bit within his head while he was on the court.
Yep.
And I think he's going to need to be in a spot where he can kind of figure some things out on the fly. I think a place like Akron would be really good. Go to the Mid-American. It may not be as high a profile conference as the Big 12, but I think he'd immediately be one of the better front court players in that league. And he'd have every opportunity to just kind of play through, different situations throughout the course of the game.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that would make the most sense. Like, maybe even you go to Akron, you sit out this year, play your next year, and if you're not ready to go to the draft, you can grad transfer back up once you play through your mistakes again. It's a hard situation, though. Like, who knows the way that's going to go. He'd immediately be the most skilled player in the MAC, though. Like, there's no doubt. No one doubts his talents in terms of his athleticism. He's a very fluid player at 6'8". He has a lot of skill. He can shoot it a little bit. Really was a solid passer in high school that didn't show that off all that much at Kansas. So we'll see where he lands. Another high 5-star big man that is transferring from Duke this time is Chase Jeter. I was really excited about Chase Jeter, at least like in terms of how excited one can be about Chase Jeter coming into this year. He showed off a lot at Adidas Nations last summer, playing with Dennis Smith a decent amount on the floor. They were on the same team for scrimmages every day. So he played really well in the pick and roll, and I think that would be a really nice kind of systemic fit for him if he can go to a place that will run a lot of pick and roll that will try to minimize some of his more, some of his limitations in terms of lateral mobility. And he's definitely coming to the West Coast. That's for sure. He's a kid from Nevada. He went to Bishop Gorman. He played under Grant Rice, I believe is Dave Rice's brother. I think Washington would make a good amount of sense given the fact that Dave Rice just got hired by Mike Hopkins at Washington. USC, I think, will get involved. Pretty much everyone in the Pac-12, I think, should get involved on Chase Jeter because he would be a very interesting flyer to take because he is a skilled player. He just didn't fit with what Duke wanted to do.
Yeah, I'm not too sure if he's a big that you would build your roster around immediately, but I think he can definitely be a guy who eventually develops into sort of a centerpiece kind of guy. And that would involve sitting out the transfer year, obviously, because I think there's a lot of work to be done when it comes to playing with the ball in his hands on a low block. As you mentioned, good in the pick and roll, but I think he needs to make some strides. He's throwing the ball in the post, and he can make a play for himself, or even kick the ball back out. I think that's where the work needs to be done. And yeah, I'd assume that the Pac-12 would ultimately be his landing spot. Not sure exactly which school ends up getting him, but yeah, maybe somewhere even in Southern California, maybe Arizona gets involved, but I'd expect him to be a pretty popular guy that people look after this summer.
Yeah, like you said, the key is quick decision making. Like if you get him in a situation where he just has to make quick decisions, I think he's going to be fine. And I think ultimately he's going to be a valuable player. He'll be a valuable 2-year player for whoever gets him. Elijah Brown's going to be a grad transfer on this market. Averaged like 20 points a game for New Mexico the last couple of years, but I think he's a little bit overrated by that just traditional point per game metric because he's a really apathetic defender.
That's putting it kindly.
Yes. He's a bad defensive basketball player. We'll just say that, which is funny given the fact that his dad is Mike Brown, who is one of like the defensive masterminds of, the NBA. And there are teams like Oregon, St. Mary's, Gonzaga that are reaching out. I don't really like the fit at either St. Mary's or Gonzaga for him because I think that they would just not let him do the things that he did at New Mexico, and I wonder if he's going to want to do that. Oregon's an interesting fit because Oregon runs such a free-flowing scheme that I think it does kind of fit what his skill set is, and they could really – let's say that they lose Tyler Dorsey, which was kind of the word in Phoenix, that Tyler Dorsey will potentially turn pro. Because Dorsey – the thing you have to remember about him is that not only – is he a potential NBA player? I don't think it's crazy to envision him playing a role in the NBA. But he also has a Greek passport, so he won't count against roster limits overseas. And that's really important to kind of keep in mind. It's going to kind of boost his value in a major way whenever he decides to go overseas. Like Tyler Haws made a good amount of money in the ACB. What was it last year or 2 years ago? Because he was born in Belgium and was able to not count against roster limits, even though he is American. So I think that Oregon is the one that makes the most sense for me. But what are your thoughts on him in general as a potential graduate transfer?
Well, I do wonder if his 1-game suspension is going to carry over. Because if you recall, the Mountain West suspended him for a game. It was kind of an accumulation of poor behavioral acts, we'll say, throughout the course of the season.
Yeah.
The Mountain West as a whole was kind of a joke this year in terms of different behaviors. You had like a brawl in the women's basketball game, coach-player confrontation at New Mexico, Colorado State situation. So that was just kind of par for the course, I guess you'd say. But yeah, I think he's going to have to sacrifice some of his touches and shots to fit in at a higher profile school because you're not taking 17, 18 shots a game. Even if you go to an Oregon and they lose a Tyler Dorsey, you're not taking as many shots as he was able to put up for New Mexico this season because they frankly didn't have anyone else from a consistency standpoint. He averaged 14 shots a game. I don't know if he's even going to get that at his next stop, but I don't know. Yeah. I think the efficiency also concerns me because he wasn't the most efficient player. But that goes in the hand with like what New Mexico didn't have as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you just said there. He was a 54 true shooting percentage kind of guy, shot 33% from three. He's a better shooter than that. Like I wouldn't worry about the percentages necessarily, but he just needs to be a more efficient decision maker. One guy who I do like better than him is Marcus Evans out of Rice. Evans is a guy that's had a couple high major programs very interested, as well as VCU, which is where his old coach Mike Rhodes is now going to end up after replacing Will Wade, who went to LSU. I would imagine that's kind of the best fit, right?
Yeah, there's already the familiarity there in terms of the coach that he played for at one school is now at the next school. You went through the recruiting process with him once already, so I don't think you really have to go through too much again. Maybe besides walking to VCU campus and getting familiar. So I think VCU would be the best fit for Marcus Evans. I see him a little bit in a similar situation to Elijah Brown in terms of what he was required to do for that offense number of shots he was putting up, but I think he can be a more efficient player than Elijah Brown was. So I think VCU may ultimately be the best stop for Marcus Evans, but I certainly understand why there's added interest in him.
Yeah, I mean, Marcus Evans was a guy who, very similarly to Elijah Brown, took up 30% of his team's possessions, but unlike Elijah Brown, had a 59% true shooting percentage, 39% from three on over 200 attempts. Really improved in terms of that. That was his big step forward. He became a much more consistent shooter as a sophomore. He'll have 2 years. He'll have to sit out, though. Igor Kulichov is a guy that is also transferring from Rice. Awesome three-point shooter who also rebounds the basketball at 6'5". He's going to be a good pickup for a high major program, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with it. I think he'll be eligible immediately, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he's a grad transfer. And
can he also go pro? I think that could. I wonder if that may be on the table for him, being from Russia. Being able, like you said, with the roster limits, he obviously wouldn't count against that for a team over in Europe. So I think a guy like him, that could be an interesting recruitment because he's going to have a lot more options on the table for him than even your average grad transfer. So as you said, he rebounds the ball well, averaged almost 9 a game last year. So he moves well, 6'5". He's got some good size to him. He's not a bruiser, obviously, but he can handle some physicality. So I think he's going to be a guy to keep an eye on this summer in terms of what he could possibly do.
Yeah. Another guy kind of in that same boat is Isaac Humphries, who, as of this podcast being recorded, hasn't officially announced what he's going to do. He could stay at Kentucky. He could decide to transfer elsewhere, or he could go pro, particularly, I would imagine, in Australia, where he'll probably be a 6-figure player immediately, even at 19 years old. Like, the fact that an Australian team could get him for, potentially 8 years or so, I think would be very valuable to them. What do you think of Humphrey's decision? Because I'd imagine that a lot of it comes down to whether or not Kentucky gets Mohamed Bamba and whether or not Bam Adebayo stays.
Yeah, I think it's a tough spot for him just because, as you mentioned, with Bamba and Adebayo, you're still waiting for two moving parts, so to speak, if you're him. And I don't really know if you want to do that at this point, especially when you haven't played a whole lot your first 2 years at Kentucky. And even if let's say they get Bamba but don't return Adebayo, you're still looking at a minutes crunch for him there. I would really consider listening to those offers from Australia, especially if you're talking comfortably into 6 figures.
It'd be low. It'd be like 100, I would say.
Yeah,
I think that the average salary in the NBL is something like 120, I believe.
Okay.
So I think you'd be talking like $100,000, something like that per year, which is great money. You know what I mean? Like, it's fantastic money for a 19-year-old. He'd get to move back home, but I don't know if he wants to move back home either. I mean, that's the thing. Like, some people, my girlfriend, for instance, is happy here in America, even though she's from Melbourne. So, it's all going to be a lifestyle decision for him. And, a lot of it will come down, of course, to money, because the other thing is that option's always going to be there for him. Yeah. He's such a highly skilled player, and he fits that league so well that it makes a lot of sense, I think, for him to, maybe wait it out or maybe try somewhere else. Who knows?
Yeah. And plus, even if he were to transfer, I think he's in a situation where we haven't been able to see as much of his skill that it's possibly there. Mm-hmm. So he's really going to need, if he were to stay in college, to find a school where he'll get to play. He'll get to do a lot of skill development his first year out. And those next 2, he'll be a feature option for a team. I think that would be the biggest key for him if he were to decide to transfer and stay in college basketball.
Yeah. Al Freeman from Baylor is probably the next biggest name on the market, kind of a role player, 10-point-a-game guy, something like that. Can shoot a little bit, big body, can drive, can take contact, was solid in that zone defensively. Where do you think he ends up? Because this was a surprising transfer to me.
Yeah, it kind of caught me off guard as well. I thought he was going to be a player they could kind of not really build around for next season, but have as an important peripheral figure for them. But him moving on, I would assume that at his size, he may want to look for a school where he can develop and have the ball in his hands a bit more, because at 6'3", I can't see him being a 2 guard at the pro level, So I think finding a spot where he can land and he can have some opportunities to initiate the offense would be most beneficial for him. You may have to go down to the mid-major level to do that, but he can shoot it too, so that's definitely going to help him out in terms of his possible options.
Yeah, it's all about what his priorities are. I don't know if he wants to just go somewhere else. Like, did he think John Motley was leaving and didn't think Baylor was going to have as successful a season? Did he think that he needs to improve his ball handling ability and lead guard abilities? I don't really know, to be honest with him. It's a tough situation to kind of gauge because that one just kind of came out of nowhere. An underrated name that I think we'll talk about two underrated names here real quick. Michael Weathers this year is a freshman from Miami of Ohio. He was one of 4 freshmen to average 16 points, 4.5 assists, and 3.5 rebounds per game this year. The other 3 names are Markelle Fultz, Dennis Smith, and De'Aaron Fox. That seems pretty useful to me. Yeah. He's going to be a really sought-after guy. I think it seems like he's looking to just step up in the mid-major world. I think Nevada's on his list. I think Colorado State's on his list. He's a really interesting player. Did you get a chance to see a decent amount of him this year?
A little bit, not too much. Obviously Miami of Ohio is a program that it's been down a bit recently, so didn't see
not a lot of reason to watch.
Yeah, I didn't see a whole lot of him, but he's a good player. I think the key, obviously he's going to have to improve that perimeter shooting as well. Wasn't a very good 3-point shooter for them as a freshman, but I think with a year off and added work, he can become a better player in that regard. But yeah, I think the Mountain West or a league like that would be a good step up for him. He's got the size. It's 6'2". He's not like these 6'5", 6'6" point guards you may see in some places, but he's certainly got the size and the ability.
Solid though too. Like he's kind of like a thicker frame,
Yeah.
Yeah, to be honest, like I didn't watch any Miami of Ohio this year, but I was doing draft research and I saw that stat come up that he was one of, 4 players this year to do it. And if you look back, like he's one of like 9 players to do it, and the other 8 have been lottery picks, assuming that De'Aaron and Dennis and Markelle all go in the lottery this year. So I was like, whoa, that kind of caught me off guard. And then I looked and watched a bunch of his tape on Synergy, and I was like, this guy can kind of play. I think he makes a decent amount of sense for a decent amount of programs. Devin Daniels is the other guy at Utah that I think took a lot of people by surprise. 10 points per game this year as a freshman, 62% true shooting percentage, can knock down shots from the outside, good driver. I don't know where he's going to end up, but he's a really good get for someone, I think.
I thought he was a steal for Utah when they recruited him because he played on that the One Nation team with Josh Jackson. So I thought he was a steal for them. Didn't work out, had some off-court issues late in the season where they ultimately decided it was best for him to move on. Talented player, 6'5", he can do a lot of things with or without the basketball in his hands. I think he could end up being at another high major program, maybe in the Big Ten. Just being from the state of Michigan, it could be a good landing spot for him. But yeah, I agree with you there. I think in terms of losing a player of his caliber was a surprise, but given some of the things late in the season, you can understand why both sides kind of decided it was best for him to move on.
If you told me he averaged 15 points a game in a high major league in 3 years, I would not be surprised. Yeah. He's that skilled. He's that talented. He can shoot it. Like I said, like he's a really good all-around offensive weapon with size at 6'5". There aren't like I said earlier with Cam Johnson, there aren't really any programs out there who can't use that type of player.
Yep.
Connecticut, I think, is in a really interesting spot to kind of circle back to teams because they lose Jawan Durham, Vance Jackson, and Stephen Enoch from this year's roster to transfer. All 3 of those guys, I think, can be high-level, high-impact players like in the Big East or, whatever high major league they want to go to. I mean, they're all like top 60, 70 recruits. Yeah. What do you think that this says about the direction of Connecticut's program? Because I think that there are starting to be some murmurs about, is Kevin Ollie the right guy for the way this program is headed? See,
I'm not really sure because when you discuss that, you also have to add in the conference switch. I think that was a huge factor in terms of the UConn program. Obviously, you still have the name brand that you can sell to recruits and whatnot. I think hiring Raphielle is going to be a big addition for them in terms of those connections to New England prep schools and whatnot. So that's big. Obviously, especially losing a Vance Jackson, that's big in terms of his skill level. Wasn't the most consistent player this season. You kind of wondered what the role that he and his father foresaw for him was compared to what the UConn staff may have seen coming and how that all worked. Obviously, it didn't work out because he's leaving, but I don't know. It's a peculiar situation. I think UConn's going to be okay. Obviously, Jalen Adams returning is a big thing for them. They still have some work to do on the recruiting market. They can get some guys late. They've done a good job recruiting. It's just getting everyone to mesh together these last couple of years has been a bit difficult.
So I do like Jalen Adams. I like Christian Vital as like kind of a backup point guard type. Altery Gilbert and Terry Larriere will come back from injury next season, hopefully, especially in Larriere's case because he ended up tearing an ACL. So I think that they're hopeful that they have enough talent to kind of make an NCAA tournament run next year. They really need a big, though, because they lose Kenton Facey, they lose Enoch, they lose Durham, and they lose Amita Brima to graduation. That's 4 like high-level big men that I would imagine they were not expecting to lose, at least outside of Facey and Brima, who were seniors. But like they were expecting Enoch and Durham to really kind of take that step forward and hold down the inside after those two leave.
Yeah, that is the key. Trying to find the young man's name right now. They had a former Washington commit on campus this weekend.
Noah Dickerson, maybe?
No, it wasn't Noah Dickerson because he hadn't played there yet. But man, I think he's got a connection to Chilius. So let me find. I gotta find his name. I'm sorry.
Is it like Mamadou Diarra?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is Mamadou Diarra. There you go. So yeah,
I remember him.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, hopefully, in UConn's case, they can kind of add to that front court because they certainly need bodies, as you mentioned. Gilbert and Larriere, those guys are okay health-wise. I think UConn's going to be fine. Some people have this sky is falling mindset when it comes to UConn. It's like that team was just absolutely ravaged by injuries this year. And it's kind of a surprise they were able to do what they were able to do in terms of getting to the conference tournament semifinals, given how many bodies they lost.
Yeah, Diarra, I believe, was he like on their roster at one point as well? Like, was he on the Connecticut roster or something? Like, that whole thing is super weird because I believe he went to Putnam, right?
Yes.
So, like, I don't know exactly how that whole thing went down, but like you said, it would be a very big get for them to figure out not only him, but I think they need another guy as well.
Well, actually, it's someone different. Now I'm looking it up because Diarra is still on the UConn roster. So there's another guy that they kind of picked up recruiting on in the spring. So
yeah, okay, that makes sense because I was like, I think Diarra. Like the more I think about it, like he went there because he's from like the Putnam Science Academy and like played. I remember seeing him playing with Hamidou Diallo 2 summers ago on their AAU team. I think he was on the Wrens. So. Let's just kind of run through a lot of other random dudes. So we've got Ed Morrow from Nebraska, James Daniel from Howard, Malcolm Duvivier from Oregon State, Nick King is going from Alabama to Middle Tennessee State, Nigel Johnson's going from Rutgers to Virginia after transferring from Kansas State. He's a grad transfer. Do any of those names kind of stick out? Mariel Shayok and Darius Thompson as well are leaving Virginia. Jared Reiter too, but I don't know that we need to discuss him all that much. Do any of those names stick out as potential difference makers over the course of the next couple of years?
I would say possibly James Daniel, although he's going to be in a far different situation than what he was at Howard rather. Yeah. Where he's a volume shooter, volume scorer. He definitely put the ball in the basket, but he's not going to have as many opportunities. I know recently you heard about Michigan being interested in him. And to circle back on UConn, there's another Mamadou Diarra. So Mamadou spelled differently in this case, but that won't be confusing at all if you have 2 Mamadou Diarras in a roster.
I got nothing on that one, man.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I just had to find that for the listeners out there. But back to James Daniel. you can definitely put points on the board. I know in terms of Michigan that I brought up a second ago, that would probably be a good fit because of the way that John Beilein's offense is run and the number of options that he can have on the floor, where there won't be that kind of pressure on a guy like Daniel to score and take shots consistently. So I think that may be a situation that could work out well for James Daniel. But when it comes to those guys who jump from a low major conference all the way up to high majors, you really don't know what's going to happen because it's really tough to predict that because of the raise in competition.
Yeah, I honestly have no idea how good of a shooter he is. He's shot, I think, like 32% or something like that from three over the course of his career, over 1 billion attempts. So, I'm not sure if he's a solid shooter that just takes a bunch of attempts and would fit well with Beilein spacing the floor, or if he is, just more of he's definitely a good slasher, no doubt about that. He draws fouls at an extremely high rate. To me, he screams, go to the American. Don't go to, Michigan. I think that's kind of asking a lot in terms of an upgrade in talent level, but maybe he does end up going to Michigan and succeeding, and, everyone talks about the MEAC as a hotbed of talent. So we'll see. Let's talk about some higher level recruits over the last couple years that just, for whatever reason wasn't the right fit. Tevin Mack at Texas, that needed to happen in terms of transferring. He was really good this year when he was on the floor, but, there were all sorts of issues off the floor. Kevin Marfo at George Washington, kind of a big-bodied low-post guy. Kobe Eubanks, kind of a 6'5" combo guard out of Texas A&M. Noah Dickerson, 6'8", relatively big-bodied guy out of Washington that was a higher-level recruit. I know Florida was in on him as a recruit. Troy Baxter at UNLV, who ended up leaving South Florida to go to UNLV this year. That was not a great decision, even though I guess both situations ended up being a disaster. Quay Parker out of Tennessee is probably one of the best dunkers in college basketball. Matt Ryan out of Notre Dame, I was surprised to see that because it felt like he was going to finally get a chance with some of the guys that they have leaving. What are some of the any of those guys stand out as potential difference makers to you?
Not really. I think a guy like Quay Parker, he kind of reminds me of Deuce Bello in terms of his dunking ability. May have gotten him a bit more, pub than he likely deserved in terms of what he could do as an all-around college player. He might be best served going to a mid or low major program to where he can develop his skills outside of dunking the basketball, because that's cool and all. There are some professional dunkers out there, but I don't think the paycheck's as good as it can be for being a good all-around basketball player down the line. So, I don't know. I think, that list, it doesn't really inspire, in terms of a difference maker within their first year of eligibility. I think there are some solid players in that list, but I don't really see, a true difference maker.
I think Tevin Mack can be, if he, gets his head on straight and, decides to buy into a program. But I think you're probably right. And, I mean, that's where you start to scrape the barrel. You know what I mean, in terms of, the end of the line with impact transfers. I'm sure I could list off 20 or 30 more that college coaches that are listening to this podcast are like, this guy's good, you should watch him, and this other guy's good, you should watch him. But for a main listenership, I feel like those are the guys that are the ones that you want to really bring up. And whenever you kind of put that into perspective in terms of who the kids are that transfer, I think it kind of brings it full circle in terms of the conversation we had at the top here.
Yeah.
How ridiculous is it that we have this conversation about there being an epidemic whenever we're talking about 25 kids in the entirety of college basketball that are going to make a high level difference? I get that our good friends Jeff Goodman and Jeff Borzello put together this massive transfer list, and it often numbers into the 700s, 800s, but so many of these guys are low major guys that are trying to get a chance to play, or they're high major guys that are, looking to go down. Some of it is, low major guys like Marcus Evans that are trying to go up to a bigger league and get notoriety. But it's so often not that. And I would say that exceedingly more often than not, it is not that. And the fact that we're calling this an epidemic is the dumbest thing that I've ever heard in my life. And whoever has decided to call this an epidemic, I never want to hear your opinions on basketball again. I just never want to hear them because it is the dumbest goddamn thing I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah. I kind of shuddered when you said the word weak. I'll never call it that. It's just people wanting to move on. That's life.
Right.
I think, whether it's sports or anything else, I don't know. It's just interesting that sports is the one area where people are so much more fired up to demand loyalty than anything else. And it's kind of like, whatever, man. If somebody wants to move on, they want to move on, let them go out and improve themselves however they see fit.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Well, Raph, do you have anything coming up that you want to plug?
Not particularly. Obviously the off season, you got the recruiting live period starting up here in a couple of weeks. So I hope to be out on the road a little bit. And other than that, recharge your batteries and get ready for another season.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to the NBA playoffs here.
Yeah.
I'm a big hockey fan. I will go out and watch some NHL playoff games as well. So thanks, Raph, for coming on. This has been the Game Theory Podcast. We're powered by CLNS Radio. Throughout the week, we're going to do the way that this podcast, I guess, is going to work from here on out. We're going to do one college basketball podcast a week. We're going to do one NBA podcast a week, and we're going to do one NBA draft podcast a week. Probably for the next couple of months at least until the NBA playoffs end. So that's what you can expect from us. I don't know what kind of schedule it's going to look like in terms of, Monday, Wednesday, Friday will be, set days in terms of topic, but, just keep it tuned. I would say that I'll probably start announcing stuff on Twitter beforehand in terms of what the topics are going to be. So thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. Like I said, took a week off, but we're going back to 3 times a week for sure. Coming up here for the NBA playoffs, for NBA draft season, for college basketball off season. We're going to get some really fun guests here over the course of the next few months. So keep it tuned in here, and thanks for listening. And until next time, we'll talk soon.